My name is Leona Walls, and at 27, I had become a staff sergeant in the United States Army. Today, I was standing in the heart of Washington, D.C., where glory seemed to reach its absolute peak. When my name was called, the President of the United States rose to his feet. The entire solemn auditorium followed his lead. The applause was thunder. But in the pocket of my dress uniform, my phone vibrated with a brutal indifference. A text from my sister, Jessica. "Mom's asking when you'll be done so we can get back for dinner. She's making that pot roast, Mark's favorite." Not one word of congratulations, not a single question. In the midst of a nation's recognition, I was just an inconvenient delay to my brother's dinner. They had no idea that at that very moment, an Army photographer was capturing an image not of me and the president, but of 6 empty chairs bearing a small, neat sign that read, "The Walls Family." That photograph would soon become the verdict on their indifference. If you have ever felt like your success was treated as an inconvenience by your own family, let me know where you're watching from. Please like and subscribe, because this is the story of how I stopped waiting for them to clap. The air in the DR Constitution Hall was thick with history and reverence, each sound muffled by the weight of the moment. The stage lights were hot, almost impossibly bright, creating a halo around the podium where the President of the United States stood. I stood at attention, my posture ramrod straight, the crisp fabric of my Army service uniform a familiar armor against the world. This was it, the culmination of years spent in the dust of Afghanistan, of missed holidays, of a life forged in discipline and sacrifice. For exceptional meritorious service and acts of valor, the announcer's voice boomed through the hall. The United States of America awards the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster to Staff Sergeant Leona Walls. Each word was a hammer blow of validation. As I walked forward, my polished shoes clicking with military precision on the stage floor, a slow, powerful wave of applause began to build. It wasn't the polite clapping of a typical ceremony, it was a roar, a tidal wave of respect that washed over me. When I reached the president, he did something that broke protocol. He didn't just shake my hand. He took it in his firm, warm grasp and held it, looking me directly in the eye. "America is proud of you, Sergeant," he said, his voice low but clear over the applause. Deeply proud. It was a surreal, out-of-body moment. This was the pinnacle. A validation so absolute, so public, that it felt like it could erase every old wound, every quiet doubt. I felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost took my breath away. Every grueling patrol, every sleepless night, every ounce of sweat and blood I'd poured into my career, it was all worth it. It had to be. But even then, as I stood in the warmth of that national spotlight, a familiar, cold feeling slithered into my chest. A draft of air that no uniform could protect me from, a chill that had followed me my entire life. And then I felt it. A vibration. A single brutal buzz against my hip from the phone in my pocket. It was like a bucket of ice water thrown on a roaring fire. While the sound of a nation's applause still echoed in my ears, I was being pulled back into the small, suffocating world of my family's indifference. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew. But the message glowed in my mind as if I'd already read it. Jessica's words about the pot roast. About Mark's favorite meal. No congratulations, not a question, just a logistical nuisance. The memory of last week's phone call came flooding back, sharp and painful. I had called home, my voice tight with a nervous excitement I couldn't contain, to tell them about the ceremony. My mother, Brenda, had listened with a long, weary sigh on the other end of the line. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she had said, her tone as flat as the Ohio landscape. "But don't make everyone wait too long, you know? The traffic back to Ohio is terrible on a weekday. No joy, no pride, just a cold calculation of their own convenience." The feeling of being a burden, an event to be endured rather than celebrated, came roaring back with a vengeance that stole the air from my lungs. When the ceremony finally concluded, I made my way down from the stage. The applause had faded, replaced by the polite murmur of dignitaries and high-ranking officers. I could have gone straight to the reception, could have shaken more hands and accepted more praise. Instead, I made a detour. I walked deliberately toward the front row, where 6 seats had been reserved under a pristine, white card that read, "The Walls Family." They were empty. It wasn't just empty. It was a perfect, absolute emptiness. There was no forgotten coat draped over a seat back. No purse left on the floor. Not a single program had been picked up and left behind. It was a sterile void, a clean slate of absence. This wasn't a last-minute cancellation or a traffic jam. It was a message, delivered with the devastating power of silence. I could almost hear Jessica's voice, dripping with her signature sarcasm from a family barbecue years ago. "What's the big deal? Why do you always have to be so extra about everything?" Now these 6 empty chairs were screaming those words for her. They were the tangible physical proof of every time I'd been made to feel invisible. They were the verdict on a lifetime of trying to be seen. Just then, a man stepped quietly to my side. I recognized him instantly. Marcus, an Army photographer I'd met briefly at Bagram Airfield. He was a quiet man whose eyes saw more than most. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer condolences or ask what was wrong. He simply raised his camera. He didn't aim it at my face or at the medals pinned to my chest. He aimed it past me, focusing on the haunting tableau of a decorated soldier standing alone, staring at 6 empty chairs. The click of the shutter was the only sound in the sudden stillness. It was sharp, clinical, and final. In that instant, I knew. That sound, that single captured moment, was more important than the president's handshake. It was more real than the medal on my chest. This wasn't the beginning of a new chapter. It was the full, emphatic stop at the end of an old, painful book I had spent my entire life trying and failing to rewrite. Those empty chairs in Constitution Hall, they weren't the first. They were just the loudest echo of a story that began long before I ever wore a uniform, in the empty seats of a high school auditorium in Rust Belt, Ohio. The indifference I felt from my family that day wasn't a sudden event. It was a pattern, etched into my life through 1,000 small cuts, each one leaving a scar that I tried to hide. The first scar I can trace with perfect clarity formed when I was 16. I had poured my heart into a statewide essay competition on the theme, "The Meaning of Service." For weeks, I'd stayed up late, surrounded by books, feeling a fire in my chest that I couldn't yet name. When I won, I felt like I could fly. I remember walking into our house, the official certificate clutched in my hand. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, my name spelled out in elegant calligraphy beneath the Ohio State seal. It felt important. It felt real. I placed it carefully on the granite kitchen counter, propping it against the fruit bowl, right where everyone would see it. I didn't say anything. I just wanted them to discover it, to feel a flicker of the pride I felt. I imagined my mom finding it, her eyes widening, maybe even calling my dad over to look. The next morning, I came downstairs to find my mom, Brenda, at the counter with her morning iced coffee. And there was my certificate, lying flat on the granite. Her glass, beaded with condensation, was sitting right in the middle of it. A dark, wet ring was already bleeding into the paper, warping my name. My breath caught in my throat. I just stood there, staring. She followed my gaze, then picked up her glass with a little laugh. "Oh, goodness," she said, dabbing at the wet spot with a paper towel, smearing the ink. "I thought this was just a piece of scrap paper. Honestly, sweetie, what's the big deal?" What's the big deal? The words hung in the air, heavier than any metal. That evening, my mom, my dad, and Mark all piled into the minivan to go to Jessica's cheerleading competition. She was the star, the one whose achievements were tangible and easy to applaud. I went to the essay awards ceremony alone. I wore my best dress, a simple blue one I'd saved up for, and sat in a row by myself, surrounded by the joyful chatter of other families. I clapped for the other winners when their parents cheered. When my name was called, the applause in my section was just a polite scattering from strangers. I accepted my plaque and walked back to an empty seat. 2 years later, at my high school graduation, that same foolish hope flickered again. Standing on the football field in my cap and gown, I spotted our family's minivan in the parking lot. They came, I thought, a wave of relief washing over me. This time, they came. I scanned the bleachers during the ceremony, but I couldn't find them. Still, the van was there. That had to mean something. After the ceremony ended and we tossed our caps into the humid Ohio air, I realized the truth. My mother had only driven to the school to pick up Jessica, who needed a ride to the mall to find the perfect shoes for prom. I called my mom, the sounds of celebration and happy families all around me. "Oh, you're done. Good," she said, her voice distracted. "Can you get a ride home? Jessica and I are stuck in traffic at the mall." I sat on the curb outside the school, my diploma rolled up tightly in my hand, the ribbon creasing under my grip. I watched car after car pull away, filled with laughing graduates and proud parents. I was invisible again. I walked the 3 miles home in my cap and gown, the setting sun casting a long, lonely shadow in front of me. The dismissal of my passions became a public sport. At a family cookout one summer, my uncle asked what I was up to. I was a cadet in the JROTC program at the time, and I started explaining an upcoming drill competition, my voice filled with excitement about the precision and teamwork involved. Before I could finish, Jessica let out a loud, theatrical sigh. She rolled her eyes and said to everyone within earshot, "She's still playing soldier. Thinks she's G.I. Jane or something." My brother, Mark, the cowardly accomplice, let out a bark of laughter. A few cousins snickered. My face burned with a hot, shameful flush. I looked down at my perfectly polished JROTC boots, the ones I'd spent hours shining until I could see my reflection. Suddenly, the uniform I wore with so much pride felt ridiculous. It felt like a costume, a joke. That word, costume, stuck with me. It was the final weapon they used against me the day I announced I was enlisting in the Army for real. We were all in the living room, the TV droning on in the background. I took a deep breath and told them. My father said nothing, just gave a slow, disappointed shake of his head. My mother let out one of her signature sighs, the sound of a martyr bearing a terrible burden. "Leona, you're throwing your life away," she said. "Why can't you be more like your sister? Find a nice, normal job. Get married." Jessica leaned back on the sofa, a smirk playing on her lips. "Let's see how long she lasts in the real game," she scoffed. Something inside me, something that had been beaten down and silenced for years, finally snapped. I looked away from my parents, away from Mark, and directly into my sister's mocking eyes. My voice, for the first time in my life when facing her, didn't tremble. It was low, steady, and cold. "It's not a costume," I said, "if you can't take it off." So if it wasn't a costume, what was it? It was a life. A life that began with a silent departure on a gray Ohio morning. The day I shipped out for basic training, the sky was the color of steel, spitting a cold, miserable drizzle that seemed to seep right into your bones. I dragged my olive drab duffel bag, heavy with everything the recruiter told me to bring, to the front door. In the living room, the garish, cheerful sounds of "The Price is Right" filled the silence. My mother was on the couch, her eyes glued to the screen as a contestant frantically guessed the price of a new sedan. "Mom, I'm leaving," I said, my voice feeling small and thin in the oversized room. Brenda didn't turn around. She just gave a limp wave over the back of the sofa. "Okay, honey, be safe. Call when you get there." That was it. No hug. No, "Good luck." No, "I'm proud of you." Mark and Jessica weren't even home. I closed the door behind me, the sound of the latch clicking shut, feeling unnervingly final. The journey to my new life didn't begin with a heartfelt farewell. It began at the Cleveland Greyhound station, a place that smelled of disinfectant and quiet desperation. I stood by myself, watching other recruits surrounded by their families. There were tearful mothers clutching their sons, proud fathers giving firm handshakes and awkward, back-thumping hugs. Girlfriends were crying. Little brothers were looking on with wide, admiring eyes. And then there was me, a ghost at the feast. I felt completely untethered, a person who belonged nowhere, on her way to somewhere no one at home cared about. On the long bus ride to MEPS, the military entrance processing station, I put in my headphones and for the first time listened to a podcast by a researcher named Brené Brown. She talked about the power of vulnerability. Her voice was a small island of warmth in an ocean of institutional coldness. Vulnerability is not weakness, she said. It's our greatest measure of courage. The words planted a seed in the barren soil of my heart. From Fort Jackson, South Carolina, a world away from the gray Ohio drizzle, I sent home my first picture. I was in my camouflage fatigues, my face smeared with mud from the obstacle course, my hair slicked back with sweat. I was exhausted, filthy, but my eyes burned with a pride I'd never felt before. I was becoming something real. Over a week later, an email from my mother finally arrived. My heart leaped. I opened it, hungry for a word of encouragement. The subject line read, "Regarding the houseplants." I blinked. The email was a full page long with detailed, bullet-pointed instructions on the watering schedule for her ferns, the specific fertilizer for the African violets, and a reminder to tell Jessica to rotate the ficus tree. I scrolled down, my hopes sinking with every line. At the very bottom, almost an afterthought, was a single sentence. P.S. Your picture looked okay. I sat on the edge of my metal bunk bed, the coarse wool blanket scratching my legs, and read that line over and over again. Okay. The word was so small, so dismissive, it felt like a punch to the gut. I stared at it until the letters blurred through the hot tears welling in my eyes. My first Christmas away from home, I was stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. A raw, damp cold had settled over the base. I scraped together what little money I had from my private's pay to buy and ship presents home for everyone. A nice scarf for my mom, a new video game for Mark, a gift card to her favorite store for Jessica. I wanted them to know I was thinking of them. On Christmas Day, I got a group text from Jessica. The X for the scarf, it read, followed by a photo. It was the whole family: Mom, Dad, Mark, Jessica, even my aunt and uncle, crowded around their glittering Christmas tree, mugs of what was probably eggnog in their hands, all of them smiling and laughing. A perfect holiday portrait. No one asked what I was doing. No one asked if I was lonely. I was just an item on a checklist, a gift acknowledged before they moved on with their celebration. That night, I sat alone in the nearly empty mess hall, the cavernous room echoing with the hum of the refrigerators. I ate dry, lukewarm turkey and lumpy, instant mashed potatoes from a plastic tray, trying to swallow the thick knot of grief that had formed in my throat. The final, deepest cut came a year later. I was preparing for my first deployment to Afghanistan. The reality of it was terrifying, a gnawing fear that lived in the pit of my stomach. I called home, needing to hear a voice, any voice, that sounded like it cared. My mother answered, and her voice was heavy with irritation before I even said why I was calling. "What is it, Leona?" "Mom," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. I'm being deployed. To Afghanistan." There was a long, tired sigh. "Again?" "Leona, I really don't have the headspace to worry about this stuff right now. Do you have any idea what a nightmare my day has been? The dishwasher just broke." A broken dishwasher. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. My fear, my service, the very real possibility that I might not come home. All of it was weighed on a scale against a broken home appliance and found to be less important. It wasn't just indifference anymore. It was a profound, soul-crushing invalidation. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't say anything. I just pressed the end call button on my phone. My hands were shaking, not with fear of the war to come, but with a white-hot rage I had never allowed myself to feel before. I walked out of the barracks, straight to the base gym. I found a heavy bag hanging in the corner, and I started punching. I wasn't trained to box, I just hit it, again and again, pouring every ignored achievement, every lonely holiday, every casual dismissal into my fists. I punched until my breath came in ragged sobs, until the skin over my knuckles split and bled. The pain was clean, it was real. And in that moment, it was the only thing that was truly mine. My mother didn't have the headspace to worry about me, but halfway across the world, in the dust and grit of Afghanistan, my platoon sergeant, a tough-as-nails Texan named Miller, seemed to have nothing but. He was the first person in my entire life who didn't just look at me, but actually saw me. Platoon Sergeant Miller was a man carved from granite and leather, with a slow Texas drawl and eyes that missed nothing. He was nearing retirement, and he carried the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who had seen it all. Where others in my platoon saw a quiet, stoic soldier who followed orders, the one they called walls because of the emotional fortress I'd built around myself, Miller saw something different. He didn't see a follower, he saw a tactician. He saw the way I quietly observed patrol routes, the way I cared for my gear and the gear of the soldiers next to me without needing to be told. He saw focus where others saw aloofness, and determination where they saw a lack of emotion. He never praised me with flowery speeches. His approval came in small, significant gestures. He'd assign me to point on a dangerous patrol, or put me in charge of coordinating comms during a complex operation. His trust wasn't given in words, it was given in responsibility. He'd hand me a mission file, meet my gaze with his steady own, and say the 5 words that began to rebuild my foundation. I trust you, Walls. That was it. And it was everything. The moment that truly changed things came on Thanksgiving. We were at Bagram Airfield, a sprawling, chaotic city of military life dropped in the middle of a war zone. The air that day was a strange mix. The familiar, comforting smell of roasting turkey from the mess hall clashing with the ever-present stench of desert dust and diesel fumes. For Americans, Thanksgiving is the ultimate family holiday. For soldiers overseas, it's one of the hardest days of the year, a stark reminder of everything you're missing. In a quiet corner of my mind, I found myself reading a passage from a book I'd downloaded, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote that the last of the human freedoms was to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. I was trying to choose gratitude, but it was a struggle. I was sitting alone at a long table in the corner of the mess hall, pushing lukewarm stuffing around my tray with a fork. The room was loud with the forced cheerfulness of soldiers trying to make the best of it. I kept my head down, focusing on my food, when a tray clattered onto the table across from me. It was Sergeant Miller. He sat down, his presence filling the space. "Not calling home, Walls?" he asked, his voice casual. I shook my head, not looking up. "They're busy," I said quietly. The lie was so practiced it tasted like truth. Miller didn't press. He didn't offer empty platitudes or ask more questions. He just nodded, as if he understood everything I wasn't saying. He ate in silence for a moment, then used his fork to push the enormous slice of pumpkin pie from his tray onto mine. "Eat it. That's an order," he said. A rare ghost of a smile touched the corners of his eyes. It was just a piece of pie. But in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. It was a simple act of kindness, of acknowledgement that asked for nothing in return. It was the kind of quiet care I'd craved my entire life. A few weeks later, after a tense, grueling patrol that had left everyone on edge, Miller called me into his makeshift office, a tiny plywood box that always smelled like burnt coffee. He had a map spread out on his desk. He pointed to a specific grid coordinate. "You know why your call to pull back 50 meters today saved this entire squad, don't you?" I explained my reasoning, the unfavorable terrain, the lack of cover, a gut feeling that the silence up ahead was wrong. He nodded slowly. "That's right. But it's more than that. It's because you know how to listen to the silence. You hear what isn't there. Most people just listen to the noise." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "That's a gift, Walls. Don't you ever lose it." For the first time in my life, someone had seen my quiet nature not as a weakness, not as something to be fixed or teased, but as a strength, a gift. The day Sergeant Miller was scheduled to fly home for his retirement, he called me over one last time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy bronze coin, pressing it firmly into my palm. It was his unit's challenge coin, an emblem of belonging and shared hardship. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you what you're worth, Walls," he said, his voice low and firm. "Not your CO, not a politician, not even your own family." He held my gaze. "Your value is measured by the people you protect and by the integrity you keep. That's it. That's the whole damn list." He shook my hand. His grip was like iron, a silent promise of faith that I could feel long after he let go. That coin became my talisman. I kept it in my pocket on every patrol. Its weight a constant, tangible reminder that somewhere in the world, someone saw my true worth. It was a value that wasn't awarded in a ceremony or printed on a certificate. It was forged in the quiet trust of a good man, in the silent language of a shared piece of pie, and in the harsh, beautiful landscape of a chosen family. The weight of Sergeant Miller's coin in my pocket had given me a flicker of hope. For the first time in my life, I felt anchored to something real, to a value system that I had earned. Maybe, I thought, just maybe, things could be different now. Maybe I could be different. That fragile hope lasted until my 27th birthday. I was at a remote forward operating base in Kandahar province, a dusty, sun-bleached outpost where the distant thud of mortar fire was as common as the call to prayer. It was a place where you learned to live with a low-grade hum of fear vibrating just beneath your skin. It was my birthday, but the day was like any other. Scorching heat, the taste of sand in my mouth, the constant weight of my body armor. Then my phone buzzed. A FaceTime call. From home. A stupid, treacherous little flame of hope ignited in my chest. They remembered. Maybe the distance, the danger, the reality of where I was had finally sunk in. Maybe this time would be different. My heart started to pound with a nervous, childish anticipation. The Wi-Fi signal in my tent was notoriously unreliable, so I scrambled outside, my boots kicking up clouds of fine, beige dust. I ran toward the comms tent, holding my phone up to the sky as if pleading with the satellites for a clear connection. My palms were sweating. I finally found a spot with 3 bars of signal and hit accept. The screen flickered to life, showing a scene of chaotic, cheerful celebration. Balloons, blue and green, bobbed in the background. My whole family was there, crowded into the living room, wearing party hats. And they were all looking at the phone, shouting in unison, "Happy birthday!" For a single, beautiful second, my heart soared. And then the camera, held by my mother, panned away from her face and swung around the room. It settled on a huge, store-bought sheet cake blazing with candles. And sitting in front of it, in a high chair, was my nephew, Mark's son. It was his birthday, too. He was turning 4. "Oh, Leona, there you are." My mother's voice crackled through the speaker, distracted and distant. "Hold on a second, sweetie. You've got to see this. Little Mark is about to blow out his candles." The next 10 minutes were some of the most surreal and humiliating of my life. I became a forced spectator at my own nephew's birthday party, on my own birthday, from 7,000 miles away. Through the glitchy, pixelated screen, I watched them sing. I watched them cheer as he spat all over the cake. I watched them pass around brightly wrapped presents. I saw my brother Mark lift his son into the air, saw the pure, uncomplicated joy on his face. I was a ghost again, haunting a celebration I wasn't truly part of. The connection kept freezing, the audio dropping out, trapping their smiling faces in distorted, silent tableaus of a happy family I didn't belong to. I just stood there, under the relentless Afghan sun, my uniform sticking to my skin, a silent, invisible guest of honor at a party that wasn't for me. Finally, the phone was passed to my sister. Jessica's face filled the screen, her expression a familiar mix of boredom and condescension. "Oh, hey, Leona," she said, chewing on a piece of cake. "You're still in wherever that is, right? Wow. Looks dusty." She glanced off screen. "Okay, we gotta go. They're cutting the rest of the cake." She turned back to me, offering a dismissive little wave. "Happy birthday or whatever." The screen went black. She hadn't even waited for me to reply. She just hung up. I stood frozen in the middle of the fob, the phone still clutched in my hand, its dark screen reflecting my own stunned face. The wind picked up, whipping sand into my eyes, but I didn't blink. The hot, dry air felt like it was sucking the very breath from my lungs. It wasn't anger that I felt. It was a vast, hollow emptiness. It was the crushing weight of humiliation. They hadn't forgotten my birthday. In a way, that was so much worse. They had remembered, and in the calculus of their lives, I was an afterthought. A brief, inconvenient interruption to their celebration. My life, my safety, my entire existence had been reduced to or whatever. That night, back in the quiet darkness of my tent, I didn't cry. The capacity for tears felt like a luxury I no longer had. The pain was too deep, too old. Crying wouldn't fix it. Instead, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. It was the kind of clarity that comes after a high fever breaks, leaving the world sharp and unforgivingly real. I had spent 27 years trying to earn a seat at their table, hoping that one day they would finally see me. I had crossed oceans, walked through fire, and collected medals, all with the faint, foolish hope that this achievement, this sacrifice, would be the one that finally made them proud. It never would be. Calmly, deliberately, I walked back to the comms tent where the Wi-Fi was strongest. I sat down, opened my phone, and went to my contacts list. I found home. I pressed and held. The option appeared, delete contact. I tapped it without hesitation. Then I found Mom. Delete. Jessica. Delete. Mark. Delete. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of surrender. Not a surrender to them, but a surrender of the fight itself. I was laying down my arms. I was walking off the field. I was done trying to win a game that was rigged from the start. The game was over. I had just set myself free. After I deleted their numbers from my phone, a strange quiet settled over me. It wasn't the peace I had read about, not a gentle calm, but a stark, echoing void. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting stops, filled with the ghosts of what used to be. The desperate, pleading hope that had been my constant companion for 27 years was gone, and its absence left me feeling hollowed out, scoured clean. In that void, there was no room for fear, no space for anxiety. This new cold stillness became a strange kind of armor, and a few months after that bitter birthday, it saved my life. My unit was on a routine patrol deep in the Arghandab River Valley when the world exploded. It was a perfectly executed, complex ambush. An IED detonated under the lead vehicle, and before the dust even settled, the ridge above us erupted with the fiery trails of RPGs and the relentless chatter of machine gun fire. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. Our comm system went down in the first 30 seconds, severing our link to the outside world. Panic is a virus, and in the swirling dust and noise, it spreads with terrifying speed. I could see it in the wide eyes of the younger soldiers, but I felt nothing. The part of my brain that feels was simply offline, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged clarity that felt almost supernatural. I didn't see a terrifying whirlwind of death. I saw a chessboard. I saw angles of fire, areas of cover, and paths of egress. My voice, when I started shouting orders, was steady and clear, cutting through the din. I organized a defensive perimeter, repositioned our heavy weapons, and directed the medics to the wounded with a detached efficiency. While others were pinned down, I remembered a piece of old-school fieldcraft Sergeant Miller had once mentioned. I scrambled for my signal mirror, and using the harsh Afghan sun as my ally, flashed our grid coordinates in Morse code to an Apache gunship that had just crested the horizon. I didn't hope for a response. I simply executed the task. I coordinated survival. A few weeks later, after the noise had faded and the reports had been filed, there was a simple, dusty ceremony on the base. My company commander, a man of few words, pinned a bronze star to my chest. I returned to my quarters and held the medal in my palm. It was heavier than I expected, not with the weight of achievement, but with the dense, undeniable weight of the lives I'd helped save. It felt sacred. And for the first time, the thought of telling my family about an accomplishment never even crossed my mind. The space they used to occupy in my head was now quiet. Later that night, a Bible verse I hadn't thought of since I was a child in Sunday school surfaced in my mind, unbidden, from the book of Matthew. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. My achievements, my sacrifices, my very life. They were my pearls. I had spent a lifetime casting them before people who would only trample them underfoot. No more. When I finally rotated back stateside, landing on American soil felt like waking from a long, exhausting dream. I went through the motions of out-processing, my mind still on the quiet hum of the fob. It was during a routine check of my email that I saw it. The subject line was stark and official. National Commendation Notification. My finger hovered over the email for a long moment before I clicked. My eyes scanned the text, picking out key phrases. The Pentagon. Recommendation from your commanding officers. Highest honors for valorous action. And then my name, printed in official military font, Staff Sergeant Leona Walls. My heart, which had felt so numb for so long, gave a sudden, powerful thud against my ribs. This wasn't a dusty, impromptu ceremony in a war zone. This was Washington, D.C. This was the big stage, the kind of recognition that gets written into history books. And a treacherous part of me, the stubborn, wounded, 16-year-old girl who just wanted her mom to see her winning certificate, felt a desperate urge to shout it from the rooftops, to forward them the email, to call them, to finally present them with a piece of evidence so overwhelming they would have no choice but to finally see me, to finally be proud. But the ghost of that humiliating FaceTime call rose before me, cold and mocking. I could see Jessica's smirk through the pixelated screen. I could hear my mother's distracted voice, more concerned with candles on a cake. I could feel the sharp, final click of the call ending. The war inside me, a war I thought was over, raged anew for days. The Leona who still desperately craved their approval was locked in a brutal fight with the Leona who knew that approval was poison. In the end, I decided to give them one last chance. It was a foolish impulse, I knew, but I had to do it. Not for them, but for me. I needed to know, with absolute, irrefutable certainty, that I had tried everything before I closed the door for good. I unblocked their numbers just long enough to send a single, factual text to the old family group chat. I typed it out with cold, steady fingers. Next month, I'll be in D.C. I'm being honored at a national ceremony. Just thought you should know. I sent it and felt a familiar wave of nausea. The replies came back almost instantly, a rapid-fire volley of casual, thoughtless cruelty. Jessica was first. How cute. Make sure you take pictures of the food. Then Mark. Cool. Maybe the president will tweet about you, LOL. And finally, my mother, Brenda, the master of passive indifference, sent only a single, cold, blue, thumbs-up emoji. I stared at the screen, at the 3 messages that so perfectly encapsulated each of them. But this time, there was no sting. There was no hot flush of shame, no familiar lump forming in my throat. There was only a profound, surgical clarity. They weren't just indifferent. They were contemptuous. They saw my life's greatest honor as a joke, an opportunity for sarcasm, a triviality not even worth a full sentence. They weren't just trampling my pearls, they were grinding them into dust with a smile. And in that moment, the war inside me was over. A victor had been declared. I stood up from my couch, walked to my small desk, and opened my laptop. My fingers moved with a calm, steady purpose that felt foreign and powerful. First, I composed an email to the Pentagon Events Coordinator, whose contact information was at the bottom of the notification. To whom it may concern, I wrote, I am writing to confirm my attendance and the 6 reserved seats for my family at the upcoming ceremony. Please have the placard read simply, The Walls Family. I hit send without a moment's hesitation. Then I opened a new Word document. At the top of the blank page, I typed a title, The People I Don't Owe. I whispered the words to myself, a quiet vow in the stillness of my apartment, a promise to the woman I was finally becoming. I owe no one an explanation, especially not them. This wasn't revenge. I felt no anger, no spite. It was something cleaner, something purer. It was a declaration of independence. It was emancipation. If you've ever had to make the painful decision to stop trying with someone who would never see your worth, support this story with a like. And if you feel comfortable, comment with a single word, done. Let them know, and let yourself know, that you are finally done waiting for their applause. The email to the Pentagon was sent. The document on my laptop was titled, "The People I Don't Owe." The decision had been made. Now it was time to prepare for the ceremony. This was no longer an event I had to endure or a stage on which I had to perform for my family's approval. This was my arena, and I intended to be ready. I flew to DC 2 days early. I didn't stay at the Grand Hotel the Pentagon had arranged for the honorees. Instead, I used my own money to rent a small, anonymous room in a nondescript hotel a few blocks away. I needed space. I needed control. I needed to be alone with my thoughts, to sharpen my resolve until it was as keen as a bayonet. The night before the ceremony, I laid out my Army service uniform, the formal dress blues, on the neatly made hotel bed. For the next 3 hours, I engaged in a ritual that was part meditation, part preparation for battle. I meticulously lint-rolled the dark blue jacket, steamed out every microscopic wrinkle, and polished the brass buttons until they gleamed like gold coins under the lamplight. Then came the ribbons and medals. Each one had to be placed with mathematical precision, measured with a ruler down to the millimeter. The Bronze Star, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Army Commendation Medal. Each colorful bar was a chapter of my life, a story of sweat, fear, and survival, a story my family had never once asked to hear. As I carefully pinned each one above the left breast pocket, I felt a strange sense of ownership. This wasn't just preparing a uniform, this was a reclamation. I was no longer the girl playing G.I. Jane in a costume. I was a soldier, and this uniform was my skin, earned and paid for in full. In my hotel room, I reread a speech by Theodore Roosevelt that Sergeant Miller had once recommended. It was called "The Man in the Arena." The words resonated deep in my bones. It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. For my entire life, my family had been the critics, sitting comfortably in the stands, jeering and dismissing my efforts. But I was the one in the arena, and tomorrow, I would own it. The next morning, I went to the DAR Constitution Hall for a preliminary walkthrough. The vast empty auditorium was quiet, the rows of red velvet seats waiting expectantly. As I stood on the stage, gauging the sightlines, a familiar voice called my name. Sergeant Walls. I turned. It was Marcus, the Army photographer from Bagram, the one who had taken the photo of me at that first ceremony, the one with the empty chairs. He was here, assigned to cover this event as well. A warm, genuine smile spread across his face. "It's good to see you stateside," he said. We talked for a few minutes, the easy camaraderie of soldiers who have shared the same dusty air, creating an instant connection. We spoke about Bagram, about adjusting to life back home. Then he asked a perfectly natural question that made my stomach tighten. "Is your family coming for this one?" The old Leona would have flinched, would have mumbled an excuse, but the woman standing there now was different. I paused for just a second, then met his gaze, my voice calm and even. They couldn't make it. Marcus, with the quiet sensitivity of a man who has documented countless reunions and farewells, didn't offer pity or ask prying questions. He just gave a slow, understanding nod. "Well then," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll just have to make sure the people who were there for you get to see this moment." As I was about to leave, Marcus stopped me and handed me his business card. "After the ceremony, if you need any shots, and I don't mean the official grip and grin photos, you let me know. The real moments." I looked into his eyes and I understood. He wasn't just a photographer doing his job. He had seen something that day at the first ceremony. He knew. And in that instant of shared, unspoken understanding, an idea sparked in my mind. A plan, brilliant and terrible and perfect, began to form. I didn't have to tell my story with angry words or tearful confrontations. A single image could be my entire testimony. Back in the sterile quiet of my hotel room, I picked up my phone. My fingers didn't tremble as I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. "Marcus," I said, my voice now devoid of any hesitation. It was the voice of a staff sergeant giving a clear, direct order. "It's Leona Walls. I have a request for a photograph tomorrow. Of course, Sergeant. What do you need? During the ceremony, after I receive the medal and I'm walking off the stage, I want you to get a specific shot. Not of me, and not of the president. I took a breath, the plan solidifying into its final, hard shape. I want a picture of me walking past the front row, the row with the placard that reads, "The Walls Family." There was a brief, profound silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him processing the request, understanding not just what I was asking, but why. He wasn't just a photographer anymore. He was a co-conspirator. Then his voice came back, filled with a deep, quiet respect. I understand, Sergeant. I'll be in position. I'll get the shot for you. I hung up the phone. A cold, powerful sense of confidence washed over me, settling deep in my gut. The critics could stay in their seats. The man in the arena was ready. I had my weapon. And it wasn't a rifle. It was a camera. The moment I stepped into the Dar Constitution Hall, I knew this time was different. The air was heavy with a solemnity that vibrated in your bones. The scent of floor polish and old wood mingled with the faint, metallic smell of the medals waiting on their velvet trays. I took my seat in the front row of the honorees section, my back perfectly straight, my eyes fixed forward. Hundreds of gazes were upon us, the quiet, respectful scrutiny of a nation's leaders. But for the first time in my life, standing on a stage of sorts, I felt no fear. No anxiety, just a strange and profound sense of peace. This was my world. This was where I belonged. My eyes drifted to the row directly across the aisle from me, the seats reserved for family. And there it was, a small, crisp white placard resting on a red velvet seat. The words, "The Walls Family," printed in elegant black script. The 6 empty chairs behind it were not just vacant, they were a silent, screaming testimony. They were a character in this play, and their role was about to begin. An hour later, the announcer's voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the hall. And now to present the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster for extraordinary valor and service to the nation. Staff Sergeant Leona Walls. My name hung in the air, echoing off the ornate ceiling. I rose to my feet. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. My shoes clicked a steady, rhythmic beat on the marble floor as I ascended the steps to the stage. This was the walk I had practiced in my mind 1,000 times. Head up, shoulders back, no hesitation. I came to a halt before the president, executing a sharp salute. As he returned it, I prepared for the standard handshake and the brief, professional photo op. But it didn't happen. Instead, the president held my salute for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes locking with mine. Then he lowered his hand and, in a stunning break from protocol, he began to clap. He didn't just clap politely. He started a slow, powerful, deliberate applause, his hands meeting with an emphatic rhythm. And then he rose to his feet. For a heartbeat, the hall was suspended in confused silence. Then, as if a silent, invisible command had been given, a ripple of movement started in the front rows and spread like a wildfire. 4-star generals, their chests glittering with medals, rose from their seats. United States senators, cabinet secretaries, decorated veterans, and their families. One by one, section by section, the entire magnificent hall got to its feet. The polite applause swelled into a deafening, rolling thunder that shook the very floor beneath my feet. I stood there, stunned. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't a standard procedure written in some military handbook. This was spontaneous. This was genuine. This was respect. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. Gratitude, shock, an overwhelming sense of validation that was purer than anything I had ever known. And in that moment, as I stood awash in the respect of an entire nation, my eyes instinctively found them, the 6 empty chairs. In that vast standing sea of honor and applause, they were the only void. A black hole of absence in a brilliant galaxy of recognition. Their emptiness was no longer a private wound, it was a public spectacle. The sheer, glaring shame of their absence was magnified 1,000 times by the presence of everyone else. Under the bright, unforgiving lights of that stage, The petty indifference of my family was laid bare for the world to see, even if no one else knew what they were looking at. And a final devastating truth clicked into place. They didn't miss the ceremony because they didn't care about the pomp and circumstance. They missed it because they didn't care about me. The distinction was everything. The president pinned the medal on my chest and shook my hand, his grip firm and his words of praise sincere, but my mind was already somewhere else. My mission was not yet complete. As I turned and walked down the steps from the stage, the thunderous applause still washing over me, I ignored the flashing cameras of the official press corps. My eyes scanned the side of the auditorium, searching. And then I saw him. Marcus. He was tucked away in a corner, just as he'd promised, his camera already raised. He wasn't aiming at the president. He wasn't aiming at the crowd. He was aiming at me and at the path I was about to walk. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. I took a deep breath and began my walk. I did not falter. I did not look away. With my head held high and my shoulders squared, I walked with the steady, measured gait of a soldier who had just won the most important battle of her life. I walked right past the front row, my gaze sweeping over the placard bearing my family's name and the 6 beautiful, glorious, empty chairs behind it. Click. The sound of his camera's shutter was quiet, almost lost in the ovation, but to me, it was as loud as a cannon shot. It was a sound of finality, a sound of justice. It didn't just capture an image, it captured the end of an era. The era of me waiting for their approval. The era of me feeling like I wasn't enough. The entire room had risen to their feet for me. But in that moment, I knew a deeper truth. I had already learned to stand on my own, long before they ever did. Back in the quiet solitude of my hotel room, I didn't post the official photo of me shaking the president's hand. That picture was for the history books. It wasn't for my story. Marcus had already emailed me the one that mattered. The only one. The image was stark and powerful. My back was straight, my head held high, my uniform immaculate. I was a solitary figure of composure walking past a foreground of blurry, empty red chairs. The white placard with the words, "The Walls Family," was in sharp focus. It was a masterpiece of silent storytelling. I posted it to my Facebook and Twitter accounts without a single word of caption. The image would speak for itself. Then I put my phone on silent, turned off all notifications, plugged it in to charge, and went to sleep. For the first time in years, I slept deeply, dreamlessly, like a soldier after a long and victorious campaign. I woke up the next morning to a phone that felt like it was about to vibrate off the nightstand. It was a digital explosion. The photograph had gone viral overnight. Thousands of shares, hundreds of friend requests, and the comments, they were a flood of validation from a life I thought was mostly invisible. Old high school teachers wrote, "We always knew you were special, Leona. So proud." Army buddies from basic training chimed in, "That's our walls, tough as nails." Even neighbors from my old street in Ohio commented, "Some of us saw it all along, honey. We saw how hard you worked." It was a chorus of affirmation, a testament from the quiet observers who had seen the truth all along. The warmth from their words, however, was short-lived. Because then, the messages from my family began to arrive. The storm had made landfall. Mark, ever the one to worry about appearances, was first. His text was a block of furious, misspelled words. "You could have told us it was going to be this big a deal. Unbelievable, Leona. You made us look like idiots. The whole town is talking." He wasn't sorry for not being there. He was just angry he'd been exposed. Jessica's message arrived a moment later, dripping with her signature venom. "Well, congratulations. You finally got what you always wanted. Now the entire town thinks we're a terrible family. Are you happy now? All that attention you were so desperate for." She saw my moment of national honor not as a triumph to be celebrated, but as a calculated act of aggression against her. In her world, there was no room for my success, only for her perceived victimhood. No, I'm sorry, no. Wow, I didn't realize. Just pure, undiluted, narcissistic rage. But the final, most devastating blow came in the form of a voicemail from my mother. I saw her name pop up and my thumb hovered over the decline button, but some morbid curiosity made me let it go to voicemail. I listened to it a few moments later. Her voice, usually so flat and disinterested, was trembling. But it wasn't with regret. It was with fury. "Leona," she began, her voice tight and strained. "I don't know what kind of person you've become. To do this to us, to publicly humiliate your own family. We are getting calls, Leona. People are looking at us." There was a pause, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. "Family doesn't do this to each other. You have betrayed us." Click. I played the message again, and a third time. I listened to that final word, betrayed, echo in the silence of my room. Betrayed, I thought, a cold, analytical calm descending over me. What exactly had I betrayed? The carefully constructed illusion of a happy, supportive family that had never, not for one single day, actually existed? I hadn't exposed a secret. I had simply allowed the truth of their absence to be seen. My mother wasn't ashamed that she had abandoned her daughter, time and time again. She was only ashamed that her abandonment had finally been noticed. Her pain wasn't for me, it was for the damage to her reputation. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, looking out the window at the bustling DC streets below. A storm of accusations and rage was screaming inside my phone, a tempest of their making. But inside my own heart, for the first time, there was a profound and unshakable stillness. Their chaos could no longer touch me. Their storm could not make landfall on my shores. I opened the Notes app on my phone and for a moment considered composing a reply. I typed out a single sentence. Family is a presence, or it is nothing. I looked at the words on the screen. They were true. They were powerful. And they were utterly pointless. They would never understand. Arguing with them would be like screaming at a hurricane, a futile waste of energy that would only leave me exhausted and broken. They didn't want to understand. They only wanted me to return to my designated role, the quiet, invisible daughter who never made waves, the convenient scapegoat for their own failings. I deleted the note. Silence was the only answer they would ever get from me. It was the only language they might one day begin to understand. With a strange sense of ceremony, I opened my contacts. I found Mark's name. I tapped Block this caller. A small pop-up asked me to confirm. I pressed Block Contact. A feeling of relief washed over me. I did the same for Jessica. Block, confirm. And finally, for my mother. Block, confirm. It was a simple act, just a few taps on a glass screen. But it felt as significant as signing a treaty. It was the end of a long and bloody war I had been fighting since I was a child. I wasn't just blocking their numbers. I was blocking their access to my peace. I was choosing my own sanity over their manufactured drama. I was choosing my future over their toxic past. I had, at long last, chosen me. The silence after I blocked their numbers was vast and absolute. For the first week, I kept expecting the quiet to be broken by a knock on the door or a letter in the mail, but nothing came. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange and unfamiliar calm. It was in that silence that I began to hear my own voice again, not as a whisper, but as a clear, steady guide. A week after the DC ceremony, there was a knock on the door of my small, off-base apartment. My guard went up instantly. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw someone I never expected. Megan, Jessica's wife, my sister-in-law. She looked nervous, shifting her weight from foot to foot, clutching a Tupperware container like a shield. I opened the door. She stood there, her eyes red-rimmed and uncertain. "Hi, Leona," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I brought you some chocolate chip cookies. They're from my mom's recipe." I stepped aside and let her in. We sat in an awkward silence in my sparsely furnished living room. She placed the container on the coffee table between us. "I'm so sorry," she finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush as tears began to stream down her face. "I saw the picture. Everyone in town is talking, and I didn't realize how big it was, how important." She looked at me, her expression filled with a genuine shame that I had never seen on anyone in my family. You were always just there, you know? The quiet one, the soldier. And we never really saw you. I'm so sorry. It was the first apology I'd ever received from anyone connected to my family. It was real. It was without excuses. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness designed to make herself feel better. It was a simple, painful admission of truth. We sat and talked for hours. She told me about the chaos at home, about Jessica's defensive rage and my mother's refusal to discuss it. I didn't make any promises. The wounds were too deep for a single conversation to heal. But as she left, leaving the container of still warm cookies on my table, I felt a tiny foreign seed being planted in the barren ground of my heart. It was a seed of forgiveness. A few days later, a large, carefully packed box arrived for me. I opened it to find a stunning Japanese juniper bonsai tree. Its gnarled trunk and delicate branches, a perfect miniature landscape of resilience. Tucked inside was a card from Grace, a retired command sergeant major who had been a mentor to me early in my career. Her elegant handwriting filled the card. Leona, it read, I started this tree from a seedling the day you deployed for the first time. It has survived harsh winters and brutal summers. It has been pruned and shaped by stress, and it has only grown stronger. Now, it's yours. Take care of it. I ran my fingers over the rough, ancient-looking bark. The bonsai, a living work of art shaped by discipline, patience, and careful cutting away of the unnecessary, was a perfect mirror of my own life. It wasn't beautiful because it was easy. It was beautiful because it had endured. I returned to my daily life at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The rhythm of the base was a comfort. The early morning bugle calls, the camaraderie of my fellow NCOs, the sense of purpose. But something inside me had fundamentally shifted. The gaping hole that I had spent my life trying to fill with my family's approval was beginning to heal over, not with scar tissue, but with something new. Something that felt like home. One weekend, I drove into Fayetteville and bought a beautiful oak and glass shadow box. Back in my apartment, I undertook one last ceremony. I carefully took out every medal and ribbon I'd ever earned. The Bronze Star from DC, the one from Kandahar, the Army Commendation Medal. All of them. I arranged them carefully on the black velvet backing, each one a testament to a part of my journey. Then I hung the case on the wall in my living room. It wasn't for show. It wasn't for anyone else to see. I stood back and looked at them, my silent, colorful history, finally given a place of honor. I whispered the words to myself, a quiet promise. Just so you can breathe. It was an act of letting them exist, of letting my accomplishments be real, validated not by a crowd or a president, but by the only person whose opinion truly mattered anymore. My own. I didn't need to hide them away in a drawer, waiting for the right person to show them to. They were mine. The story ends on a quiet Tuesday evening. The sun was setting over the vast training fields of Fort Bragg, painting the North Carolina sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. I was sitting on my small porch, the bonsai tree on a little table beside me, carefully trimming a single, overgrown branch. There were no cameras, no audience, no applause. I closed my eyes and the image of that grand hall in Washington, D.C. filled my mind. I saw the standing ovation, heard the thunderous applause. It was a beautiful memory, a cherished one. But its weight had changed. It no longer felt like a desperate, life-affirming vindication. It was simply a moment. A wonderful moment, but not the moment. I didn't think about the empty chairs. I didn't think about the angry texts or the tearful voicemail. They were ghosts from a different life, a different war that was finally over. I opened my eyes and looked at the steady, confident work of my own two hands. I spoke the words aloud, not with defiant pride, but with a simple, profound, and peaceful certainty. The president rose to his feet, but I didn't need him to. The entire room had stood for me, but more importantly, I had been standing on my own for a very long time before that. And that was the only victory that ever truly mattered. That peace I found on my porch wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of my real life. My journey was about learning to stand on my own, but it was people like Sergeant Miller, Grace, and even Megan who reminded me that we don't have to stand alone. If my story resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of finding your chosen family, please support this channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. And in the comments, I'd love to hear not about a hurt, but about a healing. Tell me about one person, a Sergeant Miller in your life, who saw your worth when others didn't. Thank you for listening.